It started as a solo camping trip. Just me, my pack, and the dense wilderness of the Adirondacks. I'd been planning this for months, an escape from the city, the noise, the people. I wanted silence. I wanted to feel small under towering pines and infinite stars. I didn't realize how much silence could betray me. The first 3 days were perfect. I set up camp near a glacial lake surrounded by ancient trees. The air was crisp, and the water was so clear I could see fish swimming beneath the surface. Each morning, I'd hike farther into the woods, mapping the trails, gathering firewood, and losing myself in the labyrinth of the wild. The first sign something was wrong came on the 4th night. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, when I heard it. A low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the trees. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I'd ever heard before. It was too deep, too mournful, almost human. I froze, my hand gripping the stick like a weapon. The sound came again, closer this time. My head swiveled toward the trees, but all I could see was darkness. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the trees, but beyond that, it was pitch black. I told myself it was a bear or a moose, maybe an elk. The Adirondacks were teeming with wildlife and I was in their territory. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound wasn't entirely natural. I retreated to my tent, clutching the small hunting knife I'd brought with me. The moaning didn't come again that night, but I barely slept, listening to every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt just outside my camp, leading away from the lake and into the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human. Almost. The shape was right. Heel, arch, toes. But they were too long, the toes too thin. And there were too many of them. 5 toes on one foot, 6 on the other. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting into knots. Then I laughed nervously. "You're imagining things," I told myself. "It's probably just some deformation, maybe a hiker with weird shoes." But deep down, I didn't believe it. Still, I had planned to hike farther into the forest that day, and I wasn't going to let a few creepy footprints stop me. I packed my gear, doused the fire, and set off. I told myself the fresh air and sunlight would clear my head. The hike was uneventful, at least at first. The forest was alive with the chirping of birds and the rustling of squirrels. But as the day went on, I noticed the sounds growing quieter. By mid-afternoon, it was dead silent. No bird song, no buzzing insects, not even the wind. It was like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, and I was following a narrow trail that wound between 2 massive pines when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart pounding against my ribs, but whatever it was had already vanished into the trees. "Hello?" I called out, hating how shaky my voice sounded. There was no answer, just the deafening silence. I kept walking, faster now. My eyes darted between the trees, my ears straining for any sound. And then I saw it again. A figure, pale and gaunt, slipping between the trunks about 50 yards ahead of me. It moved strangely, almost gliding, its limbs too long and thin. "Hey," I shouted. "Who's there?" It stopped. For one horrifying moment, it turned to look at me. I wish I hadn't seen its face. The memory of it is burned into my brain, an indelible scar. Its eyes were deep, hollow pits, glowing faintly like embers. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, gray and mottled like decaying flesh. And its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that looked more suited for tearing meat than chewing. Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I ran. I didn't care which direction I was going, I just needed to get away. My pack bounced against my back, and branches whipped at my face as I barreled through the undergrowth. I didn't stop until I reached a clearing and collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even set up my tent. I built the biggest fire I could manage and sat with my knife clutched in my hand, jumping at every crack and rustle. The forest seemed alive, watching me, mocking me with its silence. Around midnight, I heard it again. The moan. It was closer now, resonating through the trees like a dying animal. But this time, it was accompanied by another sound, a low, wet clicking, like bones snapping and grinding together. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stood, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm armed. I'll kill you." The forest didn't answer, but I felt it watching me, its gaze heavy and suffocating. Then, from the shadows, it stepped into the firelight. I froze. It was taller than I'd thought, at least 7 or 8 feet. Its emaciated frame draped in tattered shreds of what might have once been clothing. Its skin was even worse up close, mottled with sores and patches of missing flesh. Its head tilted, the hollow pits of its eyes locking onto mine. And that mouth. It stretched into a grin that sent icy tendrils of fear crawling down my spine. I screamed and threw the flashlight at it. The beam flickered as it hit the creature's chest and clattered to the ground. It didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me, as if savoring my fear. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was a raspy, guttural whisper, like the sound of dead leaves scraping against each other. But it wasn't speaking a language. It was mimicking me. "Stay away," it croaked, its head jerking unnaturally with each word. "I'll kill you." I ran. Again. This time I didn't stop until I tripped over a root and slammed into the ground. My knife flew from my hand and I scrambled to grab it, my fingers clawing at the dirt. When I looked up, it was gone. But I knew it wasn't far. The next 2 days were a blur. I abandoned my camp, leaving most of my gear behind. All I had was my knife, a canteen, and a few energy bars stuffed into my pockets. I tried to find my way back to the main trail, but the forest seemed different now, unfamiliar. The landmarks I'd memorized were gone, replaced by endless identical trees. It was toying with me. I could feel it, always just out of sight, herding me deeper into the wilderness. I'd catch glimpses of it through the trees, hear its wet clicking echoing around me. Sometimes, it would mimic my voice, calling out in a distorted, unnatural tone. "Help me," it would say. "Please, don't leave me." By the 3rd day, I was delirious, exhausted, starving. The forest was endless, a labyrinth I couldn't escape. My legs felt like giving up and every breath burned in my lungs. I started to wonder if I'd ever make it out, if I'd even survive the night. But the worst part wasn't the fear or the hunger. It was the whispers. They started softly, just at the edge of hearing, like the forest itself was speaking to me. As the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in 100 voices. Some I recognized, some I didn't. They told me to give up, to lie down and rest, to let it take me. And for a moment, I almost did. I dropped to my knees in the middle of a narrow, overgrown trail. My body ached in ways I'd never felt before, and the thought of fighting any longer felt impossible. I was just so tired. Maybe it would be easier to give in. That's when I heard a new sound. Water. A stream, faint but unmistakable, trickling somewhere nearby. It snapped me out of my stupor, a sudden surge of hope giving me the strength to stand. If I could find the stream, I could follow it. It might lead me to civilization, or at least out of this cursed forest. I stumbled through the trees, following the sound like a lifeline. The whispers grew angrier, harsher, but I ignored them. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the undergrowth and saw it, a narrow creek winding its way between the pines. I fell to my knees and plunged my face into the icy water, drinking until my stomach hurt. The cold shocked me back to reality, clearing the fog from my mind. For the first time in days, I felt like I might have a chance. But then I saw the footprints. They were on the opposite bank, pressed deep into the mud. The same warped, clawed prints I'd found near my camp, and they were fresh. My head shot up, and I scanned the trees on the other side of the creek. At first I saw nothing, but then, just for a second, I caught a glimpse of it. those hollow glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. It wasn't playing anymore. It was hunting. I ran again, following the creek as fast as my legs could carry me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. The whispers followed me, louder now, screaming and laughing and crying all at once. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. Not if I wanted to live. Eventually, the creek led me to a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. It was shelter, and I was desperate. I sprinted to the cabin and threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew, but it was quiet. Safe, at least for the moment. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. My knife was still clutched in my hand. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. There wasn't much, just broken furniture, rusted tools, and a thick layer of dust. But it was better than nothing. I barricaded the door with an old table and crouched in the corner, my knife held tightly in my shaking hands. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a heavy silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement outside. And then, just as I started to think I might have lost it, I heard the moan. It was louder this time, so loud it seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. The wet clicking followed closer than ever. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob, my whole body trembling. The thing was outside. It was here. The moaning stopped, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. Slow, deliberate, like nails on a chalkboard. I could hear it circling, its footsteps heavy and uneven. Then came the voice. "Let me in," it whispered, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. "I'm cold, so cold." It was my voice, twisted and wrong, but unmistakably mine. "Go away," I screamed, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then with a deafening crash, the thing slammed against the door. The whole cabin shook, the makeshift barricade creaking under the force. It slammed again, harder this time, and I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait to die. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My gaze landed on a rusted hatchet lying in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed the hatchet and positioned myself near the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The creature slammed against the door again, and this time, the table splintered. One more hit and it would be inside. The door shattered. It stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque grin. Up close, it was even more horrifying, its skin hanging in tatters, its bones jutting out at unnatural angles. It lunged at me, and I swung the hatchet with all my strength. The blade buried itself in its shoulder, and the thing let out an ear-piercing screech. Black ichor oozed from the wound, and the smell of decay filled the air. But it didn't stop. It grabbed me with clawed hands, its grip like iron. I screamed and thrashed, kicking and punching, but it was too strong. Its face was inches from mine now, its foul breath hot against my skin. Desperation took over. I reached for my knife and drove it into the creature's chest, twisting it with all the strength I had left. It howled in pain and staggered back, releasing me. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran. I don't remember much after that. Just running. The forest blurring around me, the whispers fading into the distance. Somehow I made it out. I stumbled onto a dirt road and collapsed, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. They told me I'd been missing for a week. A group of hikers found me, half dead and raving about monsters. The doctors said it was dehydration and exposure to the elements, that I'd imagined everything. But I know the truth. It's still out there in the forest, waiting, hunting, and it won't stop until it finds me again.